In the autumn of 1831, in Southampton County, Virginia, something happened that revealed the complex human relationships that could develop even within slavery's brutal framework. A man named Frederick, a rebellion that left his master dead, and an impossible marriage to the daughter of the man he'd killed, a union that challenged every social boundary the South had constructed. If stories about the tangled connections between personal relationships and revolutionary violence matter to you, about how love and loyalty could exist alongside resistance and rage, then stay with me. Because what Frederick did in 1831, and what happened afterward, tells you everything you need to know about how slavery created impossible situations where every choice betrayed someone. The year 1831 sits at a pivotal moment in Virginia slavery. In August of that year, Nat Turner led a rebellion in Southampton County that killed approximately 60 white people before being suppressed. The rebellion sent shockwaves across the South, creating paranoia about enslaved people, organizing resistance, and leading to brutal reprisals against black communities across Virginia. But Frederick's story isn't about Nat Turner's rebellion, though it happened in the same county and was influenced by the same conditions that produced Turner's uprising. Frederick's story is smaller, more personal, but no less complicated in its moral dimensions. Frederick was born around 1808 on a plantation owned by the Harrison family in Southampton County. By 1831, he was 23 years old and had spent his entire life enslaved by the Harrisons. The family owned a mid-sized plantation, 800 acres, 30 enslaved people, profitable mixed farming producing tobacco and corn. James Harrison, the plantation owner, was 52 years old in 1831. He'd inherited the plantation from his father and had managed it for 20 years. By the standards of Virginia slaveholders, Harrison was considered relatively moderate. He didn't whip people excessively, didn't separate families unless economically necessary, provided adequate food and housing, but relatively moderate still meant owning human beings, profiting from their labor, and maintaining absolute power over their lives. Harrison's relative decency within slavery's framework didn't make slavery itself any less fundamentally wrong. James Harrison had a daughter named Catherine. She was 19 years old in 1831, had grown up on the plantation, had been educated in the way wealthy Virginia girls were educated: reading, music, household management, the social graces necessary for her position. Catherine and Frederick had known each other since childhood. They'd grown up on the same plantation, had been around each other constantly, despite the social barriers that were supposed to keep them separate. As children, they'd played together occasionally, the kind of informal interaction that happened when enslaved children and slaveholder children were young, before the rigid social boundaries were fully enforced. As they grew older, the boundaries became stricter, but some connection remained. By the time Frederick was 20 and Catherine was 17, something had developed between them that went beyond the master-slave relationship. They'd found ways to talk privately, to share thoughts and observations, to develop an intellectual and emotional connection that violated every social rule. Catherine was isolated. Her mother had died when she was 12, and her father was often occupied with plantation management. She spent much of her time alone with books, with her own thoughts, longing for connection and conversation that her social position made difficult to find. Frederick was intelligent, articulate, self-educated, through whatever reading materials he could access. He understood that his enslavement was unjust, that the system that gave the Harrisons power over him was morally wrong. But he also had complicated feelings about individual members of the Harrison family, particularly Catherine. By 1830, Frederick and Catherine's relationship had evolved into something that both recognized was impossible. They had genuine feelings for each other, romantic, intellectual, emotional. But those feelings couldn't be acknowledged openly, couldn't lead anywhere, couldn't exist within the social structure that defined their world. Catherine understood that loving an enslaved man was impossible. Even if Frederick were free, the racial boundaries of Virginia society would make marriage unthinkable. And as long as he was enslaved, as long as her father owned him, any relationship was fundamentally corrupted by the power imbalance. Frederick understood the same impossibilities. He couldn't pursue Catherine openly, couldn't speak his feelings without risking brutal punishment, couldn't imagine a future where they could be together. So they existed in a strange space, connected emotionally but unable to acknowledge it, caring for each other while trapped in a system that made their feelings both impossible and dangerous. This was the situation in summer 1831, when news of Nat Turner's rebellion spread across Southampton County. Turner's rebellion began on August 21st, 1831. A group of enslaved people, led by Turner, moved from plantation to plantation, killing slaveholders and their families. The rebellion lasted about 2 days before being suppressed by militia and armed whites, but in that time, it killed approximately 60 white people and sent the entire region into panic. The aftermath was brutal. White militias killed hundreds of black people, both enslaved and free, in retaliation. Any enslaved person suspected of involvement in the rebellion or sympathy with it was killed, often without trial or evidence. James Harrison's plantation was about 15 miles from where Turner's rebellion occurred. The Harrisons weren't directly attacked, but the panic spread throughout the county. Every white family feared they might be next, worried that their own enslaved workers might rise up. Harrison increased security. He purchased more weapons, organized white neighbors into patrols, instituted stricter controls over the enslaved people on his plantation. He was terrified, not of Frederick specifically, but of the general possibility that any enslaved person might turn violent. Frederick watched these developments with complicated feelings. Part of him admired Turner's willingness to fight back against slavery, to use violence to assert black humanity and resistance. But part of him was horrified by the killings, both the white people Turner's group killed and the black people murdered in retaliation. Frederick was also pragmatic. He understood that open rebellion in Virginia in 1831 was suicide. Turner's rebellion had failed. Turner himself would be captured and executed, and the only result was increased suffering for enslaved people across the region. But the rebellion had awakened something in Frederick, a recognition that slavery could be challenged, that enslaved people could fight back, that change was possible even if the methods were difficult and dangerous. In September 1831, about a month after Turner's rebellion, something happened that forced Frederick to make impossible choices. James Harrison had become increasingly paranoid about the possibility of rebellion on his own plantation. He'd heard rumors, probably false, probably just panic-driven gossip, that some of his enslaved workers were planning something. Harrison decided to make an example. He would whip several of the men he suspected of disloyalty, public punishment, to remind everyone of his power and deter any thoughts of resistance. Frederick was one of the men Harrison targeted. Not because Harrison had specific evidence against Frederick, but because Frederick was intelligent, was respected by other enslaved workers, was exactly the kind of person who might organize resistance if given the opportunity. Harrison had Frederick brought to the yard and tied to the whipping post. He announced that Frederick would receive 20 lashes as warning against any thoughts of rebellion. Catherine witnessed this. She'd watched whippings before, had been raised in a society where such violence was normal. But seeing Frederick tied up, about to be beaten, was different. This was someone she cared about, someone she had feelings for, being subjected to public torture by her father. Catherine did something unprecedented. She intervened, walked into the yard, confronted her father, begged him not to whip Frederick. "Father, please. Frederick has done nothing wrong. You have no evidence he's planning anything. This is unjust." Harrison was shocked that his daughter would challenge him publicly, particularly about how he managed enslaved people. "Catherine, this doesn't concern you. Go back to the house." "It does concern me. You're about to beat an innocent man because you're frightened. This is wrong, and I won't stand by and watch it." The confrontation escalated. Harrison, embarrassed at being challenged by his daughter in front of enslaved workers, became angry. He struck Catherine, not hard, more a push to get her out of his way. But the gesture was aggressive enough to shock everyone watching. Frederick, still tied to the post, saw Harrison push Catherine, saw the woman he cared about being physically struck by her father. And something inside him snapped. Frederick was strong, 23 years old, muscular from farm labor. The ropes holding him to the post were secure, but not impossible to break if someone was desperate enough. Frederick pulled with all his strength and broke free. He charged at Harrison, moving fast enough that Harrison couldn't react. Frederick grabbed Harrison, pulled him to the ground, and in the struggle that followed, Harrison's head struck the edge of the wooden whipping post with fatal force. Harrison died almost instantly, skull fractured, massive trauma. Frederick stood over the body, breathing hard, understanding immediately that he'd just killed his master. The other enslaved workers who'd been watching froze. They understood what this meant. Frederick would be executed for this, probably tortured first. But also, Harrison was dead. The man who'd owned them was gone. And suddenly the plantation's entire power structure was uncertain. Catherine looked at her father's body, then at Frederick, processing what had just happened. Her father was dead. The man she'd been defending had killed him. And she'd caused it by intervening. The situation could have ended there. Frederick executed, the plantation continuing under new management. But what happened next made the story even more complicated. Frederick made a decision. If he was going to die anyway for killing Harrison, he might as well try for something bigger. He called to the other enslaved workers. "Harrison's dead. We can run. All of us. Head north. Try to reach free territory before anyone organizes pursuit. We'll probably be caught, but we'll have tried." About half the enslaved workers were willing to try. 15 people, including Frederick, gathered supplies quickly and prepared to run. The other 15 chose to stay. They were older, had children they couldn't travel with, or simply feared the risks of escape more than the certainty of continued enslavement. Catherine faced an impossible choice. Her father was dead. The man she'd loved in secret, impossibly, had killed him. And that man was now organizing an escape that would probably lead to his death and the deaths of everyone with him. Catherine could have raised the alarm immediately, could have called for help, ensured Frederick and the others were captured quickly. But she didn't. Instead, she made a decision that shocked everyone. She would go with them. "Take me with you," Catherine said to Frederick. "I can't stay here. My father is dead. I have no other family. And I don't want to live in a society built on slavery anymore." Frederick stared at her. "Catherine, you can't come with us. You're white. You're free. You'd be giving up everything. I don't care. I don't want what this society offers me if it requires owning people. And She paused, then continued. I don't want to lose you. We've never been able to acknowledge what we feel, but Father's dead and nothing matters anymore except being honest. I love you. I want to come with you. It was an impossible situation. A white woman declaring love for an enslaved man who'd just killed her father, asking to join an escape that would likely end in death or recapture. Frederick knew taking Catherine would make things more complicated. A group of escaped enslaved people might blend into free black communities in the north, but adding a white woman, the daughter of the man they'd killed, would make them far more visible, would guarantee more aggressive pursuit. But Frederick also loved Catherine, had loved her for years while knowing it was impossible. And now she was offering to give up everything to be with him. If you come, you can't go back, Frederick said. You'll be branded as a traitor, associated with a slave rebellion. Your reputation will be destroyed. You'll live the rest of your life in exile from everything you've known. I know. I'm choosing that. I'm choosing you over everything else. So Catherine joined the escape. 16 people, 15 formerly enslaved people, and 1 white woman, heading north toward what they hoped would be freedom. They traveled through the night, moving fast, trying to put distance between themselves and Harrison's plantation before the alarm was raised. By dawn, they'd covered about 20 miles. The alarm was raised late the next morning when neighbors came to Harrison's plantation and found his body. The discovery of his death, combined with the disappearance of Frederick and half the enslaved workers, created immediate panic. A large posse was organized, over 50 armed white men with dogs, determined to capture the runaways and punish them for Harrison's death. The pursuit was aggressive, fueled by fear that this might be the beginning of another rebellion like Turner's. The addition of Catherine to the escape group was discovered quickly. The enslaved workers who'd remained at the plantation told authorities that Catherine had gone with Frederick. This made the pursuit even more intense. A white woman traveling with escaped enslaved people, one of whom had killed her father, was scandalous enough to draw attention from across the region. Frederick's group had advantages. They knew the local terrain, moved fast, and had Frederick's leadership keeping them organized. But they were also hampered by traveling with Catherine, who wasn't accustomed to the physical demands of moving quickly through wilderness. After 3 days, the pursuing posse caught up with them. There was a brief confrontation. Frederick and several others had armed themselves with tools from the plantation, were prepared to fight rather than be captured. But they were outnumbered and outgunned. After a short exchange, during which 2 members of the posse were wounded, Frederick called for surrender. He'd rather face trial than have everyone killed in a fight they couldn't win. The entire group was captured and taken to Southampton County Jail. Frederick was separated from the others. He was charged with murder of James Harrison, would face trial, and almost certain execution. Catherine was held as well, though authorities weren't sure exactly what to charge her with. She'd left voluntarily with the escaped enslaved people, which suggested complicity. But she was also the victim's daughter, which complicated the narrative. The trial began in November 1831. The courthouse was packed. This case had everything that fascinated and horrified Virginia society. A slave killing his master, an escape attempt, a white woman joining escaped enslaved people, interracial romance that violated every social boundary. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Frederick had murdered James Harrison, had organized an escape, had led other enslaved people in rebellion. The penalty should be death. Frederick's defense was limited. He'd been assigned a lawyer who argued temporary insanity, that Frederick had acted in a moment of passion, hadn't intended to kill Harrison, should receive a lesser sentence. But Frederick himself undermined this defense during testimony. When asked why he'd attacked Harrison, Frederick answered honestly, "Because he was about to whip me unjustly, because he'd struck Catherine, because I was tired of being enslaved, because sometimes you reach a point where dying free is better than living as property." The courtroom was silent. Frederick had just admitted to political motivation, the most dangerous kind of slave resistance, the kind that threatened the entire system. Catherine testified on Frederick's behalf. She explained that her father had struck her first, that Frederick had acted to protect her, that the death had been accidental rather than intentional murder. Her testimony was controversial. A white woman defending an enslaved man who'd killed her father, admitting she'd chosen to join his escape, was shocking even to people sympathetic to Frederick's situation. The jury deliberated for several hours. When they returned, the verdict was guilty of murder. The judge sentenced Frederick to death by hanging, to be carried out in December 1831. But then something unprecedented happened. Catherine submitted a petition to the governor of Virginia, arguing for clemency for Frederick. She claimed that she and Frederick had been in love, that they wanted to marry, that Frederick had killed her father accidentally while protecting her. The petition created a scandal. The idea that a white woman would want to marry an enslaved man, particularly one who'd killed her father, violated every social norm. But Catherine was persistent, using her social position as a white woman from a respectable family to gain attention for the petition. The governor faced an impossible situation. If he granted clemency, he'd be seen as weak on slave rebellion during a period of intense fear following Turner's uprising. But if he executed Frederick, he'd be denying a white woman's petition and potentially creating a martyr. The compromise reached was bizarre and unprecedented. Frederick's death sentence would be commuted to exile. He would be sold out of Virginia to the Deep South, to a plantation in Mississippi, where harsh conditions would likely kill him within a few years anyway. This satisfied the need for punishment, while avoiding the spectacle of executing someone a white woman had publicly defended. Catherine was not satisfied with this compromise. She argued that if Frederick was being exiled from Virginia, she should be allowed to go with him, as his wife. The authorities refused initially. Interracial marriage was illegal in Virginia. Even in states where it wasn't explicitly illegal, it was socially impossible. No official would perform such a ceremony. No community would recognize such a union. But Catherine found a solution. She would leave Virginia voluntarily, would travel with Frederick to wherever he was being sent, and would consider themselves married regardless of legal recognition. In January 1832, Frederick was transported to Mississippi to be sold to a cotton plantation. Catherine traveled with him against all advice and social pressure, determined to maintain their relationship despite the legal and social barriers. What happened after they reached Mississippi is partially documented through letters Catherine sent to acquaintances in Virginia. The letters paint a picture of nearly impossible circumstances. Frederick was sold to a brutal cotton plantation, where conditions were far worse than anything he'd experienced in Virginia. The work was harder, the punishments more severe, the overseer more cruel. Catherine, as a white woman, was not enslaved. But she also had no money, no support, no social position in Mississippi. She lived in poverty near the plantation, working whatever jobs she could find, trying to maintain connection with Frederick despite the plantation owner's disapproval. They managed to see each other occasionally, brief meetings when Frederick could slip away, conversations through the fence that surrounded the plantation's slave quarters. It wasn't a marriage in any conventional sense. They had no legal recognition, no shared household, barely any time together. But they considered themselves married. They'd made vows to each other privately, had chosen each other despite every obstacle society placed in their way. Catherine became pregnant in late 1832. She gave birth to a daughter in 1833, a child who would be considered black under Virginia's racial laws, regardless of her actual appearance, who would inherit her father's enslaved status if Frederick remained enslaved. The situation was unsustainable. Catherine and Frederick were trying to maintain a relationship across the barrier of slavery, raising a child in poverty and uncertainty, with no legal protection and no social support. In 1835, Catherine made a desperate decision. She would use the last of her inheritance money to purchase Frederick's freedom. It would leave her with nothing, but it would at least make Frederick legally free, would allow them to live openly as a family. Catherine contacted Frederick's owner and offered to buy Frederick. The owner, who'd found Frederick difficult to control and expensive to manage due to his resistance to the brutal conditions, agreed to sell for a reasonable price. In April 1835, Frederick became legally free. He and Catherine moved to New Orleans, where racial boundaries were slightly less rigid than in rural Mississippi, where a mixed-race couple might be able to exist, if not exactly be accepted. They lived in New Orleans for the next decade. Frederick worked as a laborer. Catherine took in sewing. They had 2 more children. They never married legally. Louisiana prohibited interracial marriage. But they lived as a family, maintained a household together, raised their children. Their story was known in New Orleans's free black community as remarkable. An enslaved man who'd killed his master, a white woman who'd given up everything to be with him, a relationship that had survived against impossible odds. Frederick died in 1846, at age 38, from yellow fever during an epidemic that swept through New Orleans. He'd lived 15 years as a free man, after spending the first 28 years of his life enslaved. Catherine survived him by 20 years, dying in 1866 at age 54. She never remarried, never returned to Virginia, raised their 3 children alone after Frederick's death. Their children grew up in a world slightly more accepting than the one their parents had inhabited. The youngest son fought for the Union during the Civil War. The daughter married a free black man and moved to Philadelphia. The oldest son remained in New Orleans and became a relatively successful carpenter. The story of Frederick and Catherine challenges every simple narrative about slavery. It's not a story of clear heroes and villains. It's about people making impossible choices, about love existing within structures designed to make certain kinds of love impossible, about resistance taking forms that were both revolutionary and deeply personal. Frederick killed a man, even if accidentally, even if in self-defense. That death enabled an escape attempt that didn't succeed, but demonstrated resistance was possible. His relationship with Catherine violated every social boundary, but it was also genuine, sustained over years of impossible circumstances. Catherine gave up everything, wealth, social position, family connections, for a relationship that society insisted couldn't and shouldn't exist. She lived in poverty and exile, raised mixed-race children in a world hostile to their existence, maintained a commitment to Frederick that survived legal barriers and social ostracism. Was Frederick a murderer or a revolutionary? Was his relationship with Catherine an impossible love story, or a further complication of slavery's power dynamics? Did Catherine's choice to be with Frederick represent solidarity with the enslaved, or a white woman's ability to romanticize a relationship that was fundamentally shaped by racial oppression? These questions don't have simple answers. What happened between Frederick and Catherine existed in moral space that challenges our frameworks for judgment. Remember this story. Remember that it happened in 1831, in Virginia, involving an enslaved man who killed his master and a white woman who gave up everything to be with him. Remember that Frederick led an escape attempt that failed, but demonstrated resistance. Remember that Catherine violated every social expectation by choosing Frederick over her own family and social position. Remember that they lived together for 11 years as a free couple in New Orleans, raised children together, maintained a relationship that was both revolutionary and deeply human. This is part of slavery's complex legacy, not just the obvious brutalities, but the relationships that developed despite every barrier, the love that existed within oppression, the resistance that took both political and personal forms. Frederick the revolutionary, the enslaved man who killed his master and married his daughter, the couple who defied every social boundary to be together. It's part of our history, complicated, challenging our assumptions about love and resistance under slavery. Remember it, all of it. What do you think about Frederick and Catherine's relationship? Was it genuine love that transcended slavery's boundaries? Or was it fundamentally corrupted by the power dynamics that had shaped their entire lives? Was Frederick justified in killing James Harrison, even if accidentally? Did Catherine's choice to leave everything behind demonstrate solidarity or privilege, the ability to choose poverty while Frederick had poverty forced on him? Can we celebrate their relationship while acknowledging the violence and death that enabled it? Does the fact that they sustained their commitment for 15 years, raised children together, lived as a family despite every barrier, does that validate the choices they made? These questions resist comfortable answers. Frederick's action killed a man, however accidentally. Catherine's choice involved abandoning her father's memory immediately after his death. Their relationship began and existed within slavery's framework, even after Frederick gained freedom. Leave your comment below. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who appreciates historical narratives that explore both resistance and love within slavery's constraints. At History in Chains, we believe in presenting history honestly, including stories that challenge our assumptions about love, loyalty, resistance, and moral complexity under oppression. Frederick and Catherine's story forces us to think about how personal relationships intersected with revolutionary action, how love could exist across boundaries designed to keep people separate. See you in the next video.